Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Delighted to introduce tonight's guest. I told her a minute ago, I got to see her maybe about, 9 months ago at an event here in town. And I told her they didn't let you talk enough. And so I wanted to bring her back and just give her the whole time. Cara Fitzpatrick is a journalist, a writer. She attended the University of Washington. That's UW. That's not Washington U. St. Louis. Yes, that's UW. And Columbia University School of Journalism. So she went as far as possible for graduate school. She wrote for the Tampa Bay Times, did an acclaimed series of articles on the resegregation of Tampa Bay schools. Is that Pinellas County?
I'm just going to fact check you.
That's fine. That's fine. That's basically
I just realized I'm mic'd, so everyone hears
my entire senior management team, that's what they do all day long is fact check me. But she did win a Pulitzer Prize in 2015. And now she is on staff for Chalkbeat, which I didn't really know about until I got to know Cara a little bit. But it's a news site. She should probably tell you about it. It's a news site that tracks developments in education. So very excited to have her here. Looking forward to hearing what she will have to say when she has the whole program just to herself. Please help me welcome Cara Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks for coming out. I don't know that I needed to talk more at the last one, but you can be the judge. That's fine. I think I talked quite a bit. And I will say the last one, one of the things I was so impressed by was that it was this idea of bringing together people who disagreed about the issue and having a dialogue about it, which I think is important. So just a plug for that organization. So since my book came out about a year ago, one of the things I've heard the strongest reaction to is the title. It's The Death of Public School, How Conservatives Won the War Over Education in America. I get a lot of mail about that. The idea that public schools might be dying or even dead is not a popular one with conservatives or liberals, as it turns out. Conservatives are generally happy to win, but they don't want to take credit for harming public schools. And liberals are definitely not ready to concede the war, as I've seen from my emails. One of my colleagues at Chalkbeat said I should sign my name in the book with P.S. It's not dead yet. So I've done that one time. I usually bring a signed book to each event, and then whoever asks the first question gets the book. And so in one of them, I wrote, P.S. It's not dead yet. And the other ones, I read other things. It's true that most American kids still attend public schools. The title of the book was actually meant to be a little bit more profound than just enrollment numbers. It's about the death of an idea. For more than 100 years, our country has defined public education as tuition-free, secular, and in theory, at least, open to everyone. The idea of the public school is as a place where children of different religious, racial, and socioeconomic backgrounds come together to learn, not just academics, but it's the shared values of a nation. That's the traditional idea of the public school. It's a place that creates community. People are very attached to their public schools. And I think we saw that when public schools closed during the pandemic, we saw how much we rely on them, not just for education, for childcare, for food, in some cases for medical care, dental care. Before we get too far into this, I want to give a few definitions of school choice programs for people who might not be familiar with them, because I know in other states these are somewhat common, and here you actually have nothing, which is, I was trying to come up with another state where that's the case, and I think maybe North Dakota is one that has no charter schools and no private school choice of any kind. It's few and far between now. So just before we get going, a charter school is an independently managed public school. It's considered public by law. It receives direct government funding. A voucher is basically the government gives a family money to pay tuition at a private school, including religious schools. A tax credit scholarship, which you hear about occasionally but less often these days, is similar to a voucher, but the money comes from donations. So you make a donation, you get a tax credit, and it pays for the scholarships for these kids to go to school. I'm going to take a drink of this. An education savings account, which people are calling vouchers, but it's a little different. These are the ones that are most popular right now. It's the most flexible option. Basically, you withdraw your child from public school, or in some cases, maybe your child's in private school, but you get an ESA, the government gives you a certain amount of money, the state does, and then you can use that to pay for tuition, you can use it to pay for online classes, for occupational therapy, speech therapy, tutoring. In some cases, you can homeschool and use that money to pay for homeschool expenses, which is very different and is happening in, like Florida is doing that, Arizona is doing that. The voucher, the ESA, and the tax credit scholarship are what people are generally referring to when they talk about private school choice. Did I go too fast? Okay. So conservatives' current view of public education then is very different from the traditional one. In the last 5 years, we've heard prominent Republican governors, such as Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis, define public education as any education paid for with tax dollars. So that means using public dollars to pay for really any kind of education that you could envision, from religious education to homeschooling. And Florida has really been a model for this concept of public education. Arizona has as well. In Florida, the state now spends about $2 billion, in fact, more than $2 billion a year on these kinds of options, apart from public education. And in that state, every child qualifies. So regardless of need, you can be wealthy and you can still use that program. Conservatives have pushed for decades to redefine public education in this way. And getting back to the book title, they've had very crucial victories in state and federal courts. And so they've largely succeeded in this. Because when this all started, there was a looming question of whether or not it was constitutional. And the courts have pretty much said that it's constitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court gave some credence to this idea, this definition of public education, actually back in 2002. It was a landmark case. The justices upheld Cleveland's school voucher program. And basically what they said was, this isn't the government directly funding religious education. So it's not a violation of church versus state in that sense, because you have a parent as a middleman. So the parent is making the choice to direct these dollars to religious schools. That's how they made that decision in 2002. The court has gone even farther than that in recent years. We have a fairly conservative Supreme Court. They're pretty open to religious liberty cases. And they've actually said now that if a state chooses to provide public benefits to secular private schools, then they have to provide it to religious private schools, or it would be discrimination. So really, it's come a long ways. In the next year, we may see the court take a case about whether to allow explicitly religious charter schools. Oklahoma approved the first one. It was an application for a Catholic virtual charter school. The idea being that kids in rural parts of Oklahoma wouldn't have access to a Catholic education. And so in this way, they could have a virtual charter school that's explicitly Catholic. That school hasn't opened. It was supposed to open this fall. It hasn't opened because, of course, there was a lawsuit. Because on the books in every state where there are charter schools, they're supposed to be public schools. Obviously, there are provisions that come along with that maybe don't work with certain parts of the Catholic faith. So there was a lawsuit, and the Oklahoma Supreme Court said the state can't fund a Catholic public school. It'd be a violation of their state constitution, which says you can't use public dollars to benefit a religious institution. Oklahoma's charter board, which originally approved this application, has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case. I don't know if the court will take up that issue or how they would rule, but it is a court that's very friendly to religious liberty cases. So we may very well see the Supreme Court sign off on the concept of religious charter schools. And if they do, it will be a huge step away from what early proponents envisioned a charter school to be. This is actually such an incredible development that it's not even in my book. Like, things have been moving so rapidly in the school choice landscape that, like, I would have to update the book in real time. I mean, it's really been kind of fascinating to see, because when I started researching the book, it was 17-18 school year. And I actually had a couple of people tell me, isn't that issue dead? Like, why do you want to write about school choice? And then the pandemic happened. And it's just been this explosion of school choice, which makes me look very smart, but I didn't necessarily know that was going to happen. So I'll take credit for it, but I did not know. Until just a few years ago, I would have said that charter schools have actually been the most successful choice option nationally. There are charter school laws on the books in 46 states and the District of Columbia. There are about 3.7 million students in charter schools nationwide. That number grew by about 400,000 in the last 5 years. Charter schools, for whatever reason, were a very popular choice during the pandemic. And it was not actually because they didn't have remote learning. So it's kind of an interesting wrinkle there. In contrast, there are still about 43 million kids in traditional public schools nationwide. That number, though, has fallen. We saw a decline in traditional public school enrollment during the pandemic. A lot of those kids obviously went to charter schools, and some of them went to private school. Some of them actually just stopped coming to school, and we don't know really what's going on with them. In contrast to those numbers, private school choice programs are actually much smaller, growing rapidly, but much smaller. Traditionally, those programs have been targeted to like small populations, so students with disabilities, low-income students, often very low income. And what we've seen in the last few years has just been this explosion of private school choice. We now have more than 30 states with private school choice programs, and there are about 75 programs total. When I do these talks, people always want to talk to me about where they're from in very granular detail. There's 75 of these programs. Like, I do my best, but it's been a crazy explosion of these programs. And some of them are still targeted programs, and some of them are every kid in the state is eligible for public subsidy. So the range is really, really incredible. Even though these total enrollment numbers are very small, this is a huge, huge change in how we have understood the definition of public education for more than 100 years. We now have about a dozen states where every single child, regardless of income, is eligible for an education savings account. These are kind of different. I mean, you can buy just about anything you can think of, and they manage it in different ways. But just as an example, so you can use, in Florida, you can use this money to pay for tuition. There's a set amount of money you get. If the tuition is less than that, you have money left over. And so you can use it in Florida to pay for Disney tickets. You can buy TVs. You can buy paddle boards. And people have raised this issue because there's strong feelings about doing that. And I think a year or so ago, Republican lawmakers debated sort of closing some of those extras down. And they actually didn't. You still can do those things. In Arizona, parents have paid for Lego sets. They've bought kayaks. They've paid for karate lessons. So it's a very different idea of public education. In Florida, I visited something called a micro school. This wasn't in my definitions, but a micro school is basically a teeny tiny school. Maybe there's 6 kids, and it's in somebody's house. In this particular micro school, 80% of the students were actually homeschooled, and their parents were using the tax dollars from their ESAs to buy classes, essentially. So maybe you're homeschooling your child, but you don't feel comfortable teaching geometry. So you pay for a geometry class at a micro school once a week. Or, in some cases, it's like 3 hours of English. Maybe you do your core subjects. And it's very, very flexible. The director told me that some kids, the parents would say, we're not going to see you for 2 or 3 months because we're going to be traveling. A lot of homeschool families road trip. But so very, very flexible. The woman who is the director of that school is a former teacher. She used to work in Miami. And she told me that one of the things she liked was the flexibility and the fact that she ultimately was not responsible for the students' outcomes. That was really on the parents. She was there to teach them geometry for an hour. If they learned geometry and the parents are satisfied, great. But there was no sort of state accountability system that she was responsible for. So I think we can acknowledge that that's very different than our traditional idea of a public school and all of the accountability provisions that are attached to that. This is a good spot to have a drink of water and also to say that I'm not an advocate. I'm a journalist. And one of the things I liked about this subject, one of the reasons I chose to spend 5 years researching and writing a book about it is I think it's actually extremely complicated. I think it's nuanced. I think there's good arguments that you could make for school choice programs. I think there's good arguments you could make for having one good system of public education that we fund well enough to actually have what every kid needs. And I think also, what people forget is there are potentially ways to have both. In some places, like Milwaukee, we have actually had both for about 30 years. So my goal as a journalist, writing this book at a time when people told me the subject was dead. And one friend told me that she thought books were out, which was disturbing on a number of fronts. I was like, we're just going to end that conversation now. But my goal was to write a history of the school choice movement that would explain to sort of your ordinary reader who picks up a book about the school choice movement, about how we got to this point today, where we see all of these headlines about school voucher programs. And it felt like for 6 months there was a headline every other day that was like, now this is the biggest universal program. And then somebody else would pass one. And so I was interested in saying, here's the history, and then you make your own decision about this, but you'll understand where it came from. That was sort of the goal. And I assumed, as a journalist and someone who gets yelled at for my journalism on a somewhat regular basis, I assumed that supporters of public education would sort of cheer some parts of the book, and school choice supporters would cheer other parts of the book. And that's actually largely been true. I had one person who told me they wanted an entire chapter about Betsy DeVos, and they only got a few pages. Sorry to Betsy DeVos. Another person was just furious. I mean, all caps, furious that I ended the book with a quote from DeVos. So again, apologies. One conservative reviewer said I was accurate but irritating. And I enjoyed his review because he likened it to watching a ball game where the announcer is rooting for the other team. And he thought I had a little bit of a public school bias. But accurate but irritating is like what every journalist wants on a shirt. So I was okay with that. At least I'm accurate. You can find me annoying. That's fine. And then I actually had a public school advocate who was very mad about the title and DeVos and told me that I was trying to hasten the death of public school, which is somewhat funny because I've spent 20 plus years of my life writing about education. So basically I've made everyone mad. And if you are as well, there is a microphone at the end of the event. But I became interested in this topic because I was a journalist in Florida for 10 years. I live in New York now, but I lived in Florida for a while, and I covered segregation for a long time. And for a little while, my focus was on these 5 under-resourced and segregated public schools, and the conditions in these schools. They were heartbreaking. I mean, it was actually heartbreaking. I would cry sometimes after leaving. Enrollment had been declining. Teachers were quitting in the middle of the day sometimes, like walking out at lunch, which I think is the only time in my career I've interviewed teachers who quit in the middle of the day. That's not really like a teacher thing. The turnover was terrible. There was no recess. There was a classroom that I will never forget that was just covered with white posters with test-taking tips. And it was like a third grade classroom. It was not what anyone would want their child to be in. And there was violence. We would interview parents and ask them what they didn't like about the school. And one mom said, well, I didn't like it when my daughter got punched in the face in class. She was a first grader. And it hadn't even occurred to me until we started hearing that from parents. I had 2 different principals cry when I interviewed them, which is not a good sign. I had one principal cry and tell me, not for publication, that she wouldn't send her own kids to that school, which is a really sad thing to say. And she wept while telling me this. So when I talked to families, they often told me about efforts to get out of these schools. And because it was Florida, they had options. They had school choice options. Some families enrolled in nearby charter schools. Some families tried to move to other public schools, non-zoned public schools. Sometimes those are hard to get into. Some enrolled in private religious schools using, at that time, a tax credit scholarship. It was before Florida really had this latest voucher push. Some of these families didn't care about religious education. They were looking for safety, and are the kids actually learning something? And if you could get that at a Catholic school, then they were all for it. None of that was really part of the stories I was writing for the newspaper at the time, but it kind of stayed in the back of my mind. And I wondered just sort of where school choice came from and whether it was a systemic solution to some of these really heartbreaking problems that I had observed in the public school system. That turned into 5 years of writing and research, and eventually this book, which I had someone tell me as a piece of advice: don't write a book unless you are comfortable hanging out with that topic at 2 a.m, because it's such a process to write a book. And luckily I am a nerd. And so I never lost interest in this. I always thought it was fascinating. And one of the things I didn't realize is that you really kind of had to go back to the founding of the country to understand some of these questions. And one of the things that I was interested in was the fact that there seemed to be 2 origin stories for school choice based on the viewpoint of the person you were talking to. And so opponents of school choice will generally say that it has its origins in segregation in the South. Segregationists created school voucher programs to get around desegregating public schools after Brown versus Board in 1954. Proponents of school choice generally talk about Milton Friedman. Very different origin stories. They generally talk about Friedman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He wrote an essay in 1955 that suggested that we should have a school system based around universal school vouchers. So basically you would buy education on the marketplace, and he thought that this was a good solution to what he thought was the monopoly of public education. So neither group is actually wrong, I came to understand. I thought at the time, how can both of these stories be true? But they are. Segregationists in the South did create school voucher programs to get around integrating the schools. In some places, this lasted for a decade. I mean, these were not small attempts to get around desegregating schools. In some states, tax dollars were used to pay for white children to attend all-white private schools. They were called segregation academies. You've probably heard that term. In Mississippi, citizens' councils, which was a dangerous white supremacist organization, they claimed that teaching in public schools at that time was being, quote, subordinated to social experimentation. They were talking about desegregation, but that's not completely unlike some of the rhetoric we've heard recently. Those schools received public dollars to pay for kids to attend them. I actually received an email from a white woman who grew up in Mississippi during this time. And she told me that her family was unusual because they attended public schools in that time. Most white families she knew went to segregation academies. She did not know that some of them were paying for it with public dollars. While this was going on in the South, there were 2 other kind of primary voices advocating for school choice for very different reasons. One was, in fact, Milton Friedman, who just thought that business was more efficient than government, and he wanted every kid, regardless of income, to have a voucher. He actually envisioned a system where wealthy families would eventually take on the entire cost of educating children, but he believed vouchers were a step in that direction. Really interesting guy. He was very open about the fact that this would result in fewer public schools. What he thought, though, was that it would result in more better schools. He thought that the quality of schooling would rise with the competition in the marketplace. The other prominent voice at the exact same time, it's so interesting, literally the same time, was Virgil Bloom, who's lesser known than Milton Friedman. He was a priest in Milwaukee who strongly felt that religious families were being discriminated against because they were effectively having to pay twice for education. They had to pay tuition at a school that reflected their family values, and they had to pay taxes to support the public school system that they weren't attending. And he actually, it's really interesting, he made legal arguments in the 60s and 70s about how to win on this issue at the Supreme Court based on religious discrimination, based on free exercise. And it was decades ahead of his time, and that is in fact where the court has gone with this, which I thought was really interesting. The other interesting thing about Bloom, though, is that he also thought that if Catholic schools took public dollars, they would need to open themselves up to financial audits and create some kind of school board-like body similar to public schools, which you don't hear a lot of that anymore, but that was what he thought would be sort of the trade-off for taking public dollars. I thought this overlap was fascinating, that you could have people interested in the same tool, basically, this idea of a voucher, but for such very different reasons. And to have all these people sort of interacting in the same time period, I thought was really interesting. One of my favorite days in the archives, which days in the archives are not super exciting, but one of my favorite ones was finding letters that Virgil Bloom and Milton Friedman exchanged. And I thought, I was so excited about this. I was the only person in the archive. So I was excited on my own, but I was very excited about this. And Friedman actually warned Bloom that vouchers might not turn out like he thought, because if there was indeed more competition, Catholic schools might actually lose enrollment. And so he was kind of honest with him about how this might not actually work out the way you think. I thought that was so interesting. But this is sort of happens throughout the history of school choice. So we had the racist voucher programs in the South start to get dismantled by the courts in the 50s and 60s. At the same time that that's happening, there are new progressive voices that sort of enter the scene and see school vouchers in a different light. So there were liberal supporters of vouchers, which you don't hear about much these days, but there were liberal supporters of vouchers who saw them as potentially a tool of empowerment for low-income families. Because if you're familiar with the school system, what often happens is you have people who sort of buy their way into better resourced public schools by buying a house, right, in an area that has what they consider to be a good public school, or they pay for private education. And so you even have school district boundaries that sometimes are drawn to kind of create these enclaves of privilege. And so the progressive model of school choice said low-income families should have the same choices, essentially, as wealthier ones. If we give them money for a school voucher, then it's harder for school districts to ignore them because they have the ability to walk away. There were different ideas about how this might work. There were some supporters who thought if you could make the voucher worth more money than per pupil aid in a school system, then it might actually be a draw to schools who would want to take on kids that maybe had greater needs. One of these proposals was called a Poor Children's Bill of Rights, and it said we must discriminate in education in favor of the poor. They thought that this system would actually cost a ton of money because it would be an effort to attack poverty. It's an interesting idea, and it did not really take off at all. And Milton Friedman basically said he had sympathy for the idea, but he just didn't think it would work. And he's probably right about that. But it's an interesting idea. That sort of social justice model of school choice, which is what we might call it now, didn't really go anywhere until the 1990s. the idea of providing private schools, especially religious ones, with public dollars was extremely controversial. I think that we actually forget how controversial. President Reagan proposed vouchers at least 3 times in the 80s, and he could not even get the support of his own party. That's how much the landscape around this has changed. I'm going to take a drink of water. So the way this got started in the 90s, because at this point, the programs of the South are gone, and school choice has basically been a theory for decades. There was an unusual political alliance in Milwaukee in 1990, where a Republican governor, Tommy Thompson, teamed up with a Democratic state lawmaker named Polly Williams to create vouchers. These guys had nothing in common. They were, in fact, political opponents who had known each other a long time. Thompson was a white conservative who had attacked welfare policies when he was running for governor. Williams was a black nationalist who made a lot of people uncomfortable when she talked about race. She had once been on welfare. And so these guys just had nothing in common politically. They came together on this issue of school vouchers. Thompson basically wanted to put Wisconsin on the map for some kind of bold educational idea. And Williams actually was opposed to integration policies in Milwaukee because she thought that they put the burden on Black families with busing, but they didn't seem to get better academic outcomes. And so she thought vouchers were sort of back to this social justice model. She thought we could empower these low-income families, particularly the ones that she thought were being ill-served by the school system. One of the reasons that this worked at the time in Milwaukee really just has to do with that city's history. The city already had a number of prominent, well-regarded, independent, secular private schools that primarily served Black and Latino students. And families wanted to get into those schools, and not everyone could afford it. So you had these schools already in the city, and some of the people in those schools became a powerful block of support for legislation. And then you also had pretty strong grassroots support from Black parents in Milwaukee. And there were activists in Milwaukee who'd been raising questions about the school system and outcomes for Black students for a long time. So you kind of had this perfect scenario in Milwaukee to pass it. And even still, this is how different this is from today, even still, it was so tiny what they managed to pass. It was limited to 1% of the district's total enrollment. There were about 800 kids. Voucher students could not account for more than 49% of a single school's student body, so the school wouldn't be reliant on the funding. They had to be secular, wasn't religious. A voucher was worth about $2,500. Students had to be low income. They had to be either entering kindergarten or already enrolled in a public school. The idea being that they didn't want to have the state pay for kids who were already going to private school. And they also hired a researcher at a local university to study the results of the program. So very, very tiny. And it was billed as an experiment. As this was getting underway, charter schools sprang up in Minnesota. Basically, charter schools were the Democratic answer to vouchers because Republicans were talking a lot about vouchers at the time, and Democrats did not think politically that talking about just giving more money to one good school system kind of won over voters. And so charter schools are basically a way to say, look, we are also in favor of school choice, just public school choice. We want some accountability. We want the institution to be public. And so the charter schools sprang up, and for a very, very long time, these had bipartisan support. Republicans were fine with them. Democrats had the thing that they could point to. The reason that the Democratic support for charters really sort of soured was actually just in the last few years. Trump and Betsy DeVos were so divisive that Democrats really didn't want to be in favor of any kind of educational policy that they supported. And so they kind of stepped back from charter school support because Betsy DeVos and President Trump were supporters of all forms of school choice. And so this has been kind of a tension within the traditional Democratic voting bloc, because a lot of families of color have been big supporters of charter schools, and charter schools have had very good results in some urban areas for low-income children of color. And now this whole charter school movement is in a strange place because of this religious question, because there are a lot of early supporters of charters who are very, very opposed to having them become religious. One of the things I'd like to point out is teachers' unions get a little bit of a bad rap, but they have consistently raised some questions and concerns about school choice programs. They've talked about accountability. How do you measure outcomes? They raised a lot of questions about public dollars going to religious institutions. Albert Shanker is this sort of legendary figure from the American Federation of Teachers. He very briefly supported the idea of charter schools, and then within a few years even withdrew support from that and called charter schools and school vouchers gimmicks. Many of those concerns have proved valid over time. We have had programs start small and get much larger, which is one of the fears. Some private schools and charter schools have closed in the middle of the school year, which leaves families in the lurch, and you can't really take back the public dollars that you gave to them. There have been cases of fraud, both in the charter sector and with private school choice. There's been misuse of public dollars. Polly Williams, who was part of Milwaukee's voucher program and was critical to it passing, she eventually grew disillusioned with some of her conservative allies because she really was interested in vouchers as a tool for low-income families. And she began to think that conservatives were interested in paying for everybody, kind of the Milton Friedman model. And she was very much opposed to that. One of the things that I also think is interesting about this that gets obscured by sort of the extremely polarized political times that we are in is that within the school choice crowd, if you will, there's actually been a lot of disagreement about who vouchers should be for, how we should regulate them, whether you should track educational outcomes and what that looks like, and then cost. So even within supporters, there's been a lot of discussion about what this should look like and very strong feelings about that. And I think that's worth pointing out because we so often hear just the for and against. I do think one of the questions I had going in was whose model of school choice had effectively won, Friedman's vouchers for everyone or this more social justice idea. And I do think it's now safe to say that Friedman's vision has really won out. And some people are very happy about that, and some people are very mad about that. The rallying cry of school choice supporters these days is often fund students, not systems, which is a very different view of public education. And this is changing rapidly right now, this landscape. But what we see right now is private school choice programs are still largely serving lower income and middle income households on a national level when you put all the programs together. But every state that has gone universal, where every single child in the state qualifies, they've seen an increase in their participation from higher income families, which makes a certain amount of sense. You're paying for private school, and now the state is saying that they will take up some of that cost. Why would you not agree to that? Most families are probably going to agree to that. So that's an interesting trend with this. I'm going to give a couple of examples because Kentucky is sort of surrounded by other states that have gone a lot further on school choice a lot faster. There was a report that came out from a fairly neutral organization called Future Ed about a week ago, and they were looking a lot at the universal programs and for trends in these. So for the 23-24 school year in Indiana, 6% of the kids who were taking an ESA, the Education Savings Account, came from households earning more than $200,000 a year. That's 6%. 55% came from households earning less than $100,000. Understanding that $100,000 is still fairly high above the poverty line. Before that most recent expansion, where Indiana is like 99%, you can't quite call it universal, but 66% of recipients were from households below 100,000. In Florida, when they expanded this, they've expanded a number of times recently, but in the most recent one, about half of the new ESA recipients came from families earning above $125,000 a year for a family of 4. So you are seeing this trend of families from wealthier families taking the state up on this idea. The other trend that we've seen with the sort of greatly expanded or universal programs is that most of the new students participating were already in private school, which I think does not get talked about a lot. But when you make every kid in the state eligible, of course, a lot of those kids were already in private school. And so again, families are looking at, you want to pay for some of this. Great, why not? So the state is essentially subsidizing private education for families who are already paying for it. And I don't want to make light of paying for private education. I realize that can actually be a real burden for a lot of families. But it does sort of run counter to the argument that you often hear that school choice is giving students a way out of low-performing public schools. In some cases, it is. In a lot of states where they have gone universal, it's paying for kids who are already in private schools. In a few places, maybe an unintended consequence, some private schools have actually raised tuition in response to the subsidy, because for them, it's a real financial boon. And so in cases where they've raised tuition, some of the private schools are not actually more accessible to very low-income families. And states have a lot of different ways of doing this, but that was one trend that's come out of this. One of the things that I said earlier that I had an interest in going into this was whether or not school choice is a systemic reform for some of the problems in public education. And because one of the things that's interesting is when this movement for school choice started, we didn't actually have any idea how any of these things would work, or if they would benefit students, if they would benefit the public school system. There was a perception that private schools were better than public schools. And so if you gave vulnerable students access to them, naturally, they would have better outcomes. A few early school choice advocates actually called school choice a panacea. This will solve the problems of public education. We've now had about 30 some years of research. It's complicated, which I love to tell people, but it's not a clear win. There have been multiple studies of school voucher programs in recent years that have shown that test scores, which is one of the major ways that we measure outcomes in education, that test scores have been about the same for the participating students as their public school counterparts, or in some cases worse. For whatever reason, math scores often are worse. But some studies have found positive sort of life outcome benefits. So students were more likely to graduate from high school. They were more likely to attend college. We don't know yet about finishing college, because you have to follow kids for a long ways to learn this. They were less likely to engage in criminal behavior, and family satisfaction tends to be very high. I think families like choosing a school and maybe feel more invested in that, so satisfaction tends to be high. But keep in mind, these studies are of the former sort of targeted, smaller programs. This explosive growth, we haven't had time yet to measure the outcomes. And in some cases, we may actually not know, because Republicans who are largely behind passing these programs have not attached as much accountability or research to them. In some cases, it might be difficult to do. If you're going to give money to homeschooling families, then how do you measure outcomes? You could maybe have them take the same state test, but in some cases, that's not a requirement. So it's sort of being measured based on parental demand. The idea that you surely would not leave your kids in a situation that was bad for them academically, so we can measure this via what parents do. One wrinkle that public school supporters do not like about the research is that competition has, in fact, improved public schools. So Milton Friedman was right in that sense. There was a study recently that was looking at charter schools, so a little bit different, but charter schools, the presence of about 10%, I think if in a school system about 10% of the schools were charters, then the academic outcomes for the entire school district improved. Part of the reason for that was that the lowest performing traditional public schools often closed because you're losing kids to charter schools. So your enrollment's going down. And then, your lowest performing schools are already struggling. So often the solution was to close them. Now you can debate that in terms of public policy and say maybe you don't close the school, maybe you throw a ton of resources at it to try to improve the school. But that is one of the outcomes of having competition, is that parents do tend to, in the district where I was covering in Florida, parents started trying to flee those schools. And so if something is better or perceived to be better, people will go there. One thing with charter school research that I think is worth pointing out is that the quality varies dramatically based on where you are, because states have different ways of deciding who gets to open a school, basically. So Boston has for a long time had a reputation of having very good charter schools because they were extremely choosy about who they allowed to open a school. Arizona for a long time was sort of making the entire charter school movement look bad, which was something that advocates talked about because they let basically anybody open a school. And so over time, the sort of bad performers would close, but that takes some time. And so quality varies. One of the other things that I think is interesting about these programs, especially the private school programs, is the cost, right? Because these things are expanding so quickly that some of the actual costs have been outstripping the projections. Arizona is dealing with this now. If you look up Arizona's private school program, everyone's basically arguing based on their viewpoint as to whether or not the costs actually are, if it's saving the state money or not saving the state money. You would think that would have a clear answer. There's a lot of disagreement about that, but they are dealing with the actual cost being far higher than the projected cost. I don't want to go deeply into the weeds, but on the theme of this is more complicated than we realize. States fund these things in different ways. So in Florida, if you take your child out of a public school and you do a private school choice option or a charter option, the dollars follow your child. So the school district loses that money. In other states, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. Some states fund like 90% of the per pupil cost. Some states fund it from a different source. It's not coming from the traditional K-12. Some states are paying for it with tax credits. And so it's not as simple, the district just obviously loses money in every situation, or the state loses money. Sometimes the district does lose money, but the state saves money. So depending on, where you sit in that, sometimes people will tell you the state's saving money. It's like, well, yes, they are, but the school district is closing schools. So it's complicated. And I think it's worth saying over and over again, because it's such a polarized issue, that it is complicated. Utah created a new program and they set a budget cap. So everybody can apply, but once we hit, and it was 82 million, then that's it. And so 10,000 kids are going for 82 million. They had 27,000 applicants. Assuming all of those kids were allowed to participate and chose to participate, the cost would have been 218 million. One thing I do know from studying this history and just the history of education is that communities are often not willing to pay for two systems of public education. So we saw that in the Jim Crow South. We've seen it in some cities where there was a lot of white flight, or you stay in the city, but the white children are largely attending private school, and then referendums to support public education fail. That happened in Cleveland multiple times in the 90s. So it remains to be seen how much taxpayers are going to want to invest in a robust public school system and private school choice options. So I can understand why, for some people, the answer is just no, because you're saying no to maybe a small program, but a lot of these things get larger over time. I hear from people who just don't want to pay for religious education. They don't agree with what's being taught. Sometimes you're paying for children to attend schools whose values you don't support. And so there's that wrinkle anytime you bring religious education into the mix. As a journalist, what I want to see is access to information about the programs. With a public school district, I can generally do employee background checks. I can get employment files. I can look at test scores. I can look at financial audits. I want all that information. And the trend right now with some of these programs is to provide less information. So, that's always the journalist. It's like, just give me information so I can compare things. In some states, you can compare a private school's voucher test scores to the nearby public school, and that begins to give you and also parents in the community some information. So coming back around to Kentucky, you have almost nothing. It is so strange. I was actually double checking myself today because I thought surely there's something. And no, you are one of the few states that really don't have any kind of school choice programs, charter or private. And it's because of the state constitution, which is just incredibly interesting to, again, me, a nerd. But the U.S. Constitution doesn't actually say anything about education. It has always been a local and state matter. And so if you look at state constitutions around the country, there's a lot of different ways that they address the issue of providing public education. And some of them have language like you have. It has to be a common school. We have to provide a common school system. Some of them have a uniform common school system, which has tripped up school choice advocates in court because these programs almost always land in court. And so it's interesting to see how different courts have interpreted the language to allow or not allow a school choice system. And in Florida, the Constitution didn't change, but the members of the court did. And so in Florida, I think it was 2006, a voucher program was shut down by the state Supreme Court. And then in the last 5 or 6 years, they brought it back again, and the state Supreme Court members had changed enough that the outcome was different. And so there's the language, and there's who's interpreting the language. And I always find this really interesting. What's interesting, too, is that this amendment, if it passes, doesn't necessarily do anything. There has to be some kind of legislation that follows. I think you could assume there would be, that legislation will inevitably follow. But it's one step. And so what that ends up looking like, if you listened to most of it and slept through just some of it, I think you get the idea that there's a lot of different ways that it could go if it passes and there is indeed legislation and it goes through all of the things that legislation has to go to actually become a program. There's so many different ways that could take shape. And what's interesting to me as someone who writes so much about public education is a lot of it actually doesn't have much to do with improving the public school system. Yes, there's competition, potentially, but so many of the things you hear about have nothing really to do with choice. It's smaller class sizes, it's more funding, it's hours in the day when you're trying to make up for what children were lacking during the pandemic. It's so many of these other questions. It's segregation. It's all of those things. And so it gives, I think, a lot to think about when considering the amendment, but also just your interest in public education and how we might improve it. In the book, I think I drove a few reviewers insane because I asked some driving questions in the introduction and then I don't answer them, which I think they'd really prefer you to answer them, like take a view. But I didn't want to do that as a journalist. And so I'm going to give you my list of questions and then you can answer them for yourselves, which is so much easier for me. Does public funding necessitate public accountability? What type and how much? How do we measure success? How central a measuring stick should racial equality be? What obligation does any parent have to the other children in their surrounding community? I think about this a lot as a parent. If we value the right of a family to choose education above all other considerations, what does that mean for the common purpose of public education? If public education is any education paid for with tax dollars, what does that mean for the future of the public school? What does that mean for the future of democracy? And then you get to answer them. And I don't know if I've gone on too long because my papers were covering up this very handy clock. But I think if you want to ask questions, there is a microphone. Oh, and I did bring my book, my signed book for the brave soul who goes first. Usually that gets at least one person to come up.
Well, I have a copy of the signed book, so the second person can. So, Cara, you mentioned the fact that the constitutional amendment that we're about to vote yes or no on in the next, I guess, 2.5, 3 weeks. I look better, actually, Paul, in the dark. So
I'm with you.
It's going to require some type of legislative action. And strategically, the legislature, I think, was very, this is an opinion, was very vague in saying, trust us and we'll figure out the best thing to do. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering in other states who have gone through a similar process as to what we're about to undergo, what type of legislative action did we see after the constitutional amendment was passed? Are there any parallels, any comparisons?
You know, there's not really, because in most states where they introduced school choice, the legislature created a program and the legal challenges followed. And then you got to see how the courts viewed the constitutional language. The language of the Constitution was always sort of this open question. And then there was also the question of state versus federal court, because sometimes you might have a better case to make in one or the other. But there hasn't really been a similar situation to what Kentucky is going through, which is really pretty interesting for you, but not very helpful.
You commented that there were people who were trying to look at the outcomes of kids who had choice versus kids who stayed in the system. Has anybody looked at what the result is? Is that the result of the education if there's a change, or is it merely a result of aggressive parents who are more interested in thinking potentially what's better for their children? And the outcome is not just what the teacher does, it's how pushy or aggressive or domineering parents are as far as directing that education. Could it be that they could go to a caboose someplace and have very, very aggressive parents and the kid would come out very, very well educated?
There's a couple of different answers here, but yes, that question, it's sometimes called selection bias. That question comes up a lot of you're trying to take something that's so complicated. And so you're trying to compare similar types of kids so you can try to make an apples to apples comparison. So already trying to compare similar types of kids is tough. So you want to say, you know, are they coming from the same socioeconomic background? You know, all else being equal, can we actually even compare these kids? There's that question, because you want to, when you're researching this, you want to say, is the thing that's making the difference here truly this school? Mm-hmm. And it's a very hard thing to get at. So usually they're trying to look at similar types of kids, and even that gets tricky. But this question of parenting always comes up, because if you have parents who know enough, are engaged enough, care enough to go out and try to find something different, is that alone making some difference for the child? Yeah. Right? And so that question comes up, and there's different ways in research that they try to account for it. But it's always a factor. And I think, you know, one of the things that you see often is that parents make a huge difference for their children, even if they have fewer resources, perhaps. It's that saying, I know what's going on in this classroom and I want something different, or I know what kind of literacy program they're using. It's not helping my kid to read. That parental intervention is hard to account for in research and does make a difference.
Thank you.
Hi. somewhat of a different type question maybe, but I think most people, when we hear about religious schools, especially in Kentucky, I think there's an assumption it's a Christian school.
Mm-hmm.
What about, how do people feel, or what would happen if they knew their public money was supporting a Muslim school, a Buddhist school, a Jewish school, Unitarian school, et cetera, some non-Christian thing? In this state especially, I think most things are termed of religious as Christian and not. So is that ever addressed? And would people, and a second question maybe would the supporters of this support it as much if they thought that? Because I think a lot of people just think it is supporting some type of Christian school.
I mean, it may be in certain states or certain areas, but school choice advocates will generally tell you that they are in favor of everyone making the best choice. So if that happens to be yeshiva in New York, where the kids are not necessarily learning all of the core subjects, school choice supporters will say that's fine. That's what the parents' choice is. And it's interesting because the yeshiva example is an interesting one, because New York has had a very hard time regulating those schools. And some of the biggest supporters of having those schools continue to receive public dollars, which in New York they do in a different way because they don't have vouchers. Some of the biggest supporters of it have been school choice supporters. They just feel very strongly that if a parent is selecting something, it's fine. In Florida, I looked at this once as a reporter to see which schools were getting the most vouchers. And it actually was a Muslim school in Fort Lauderdale. And I thought that was really interesting because I think there are people who maybe are envisioning a Catholic school or whatever religious school conjures in their mind. And sometimes it's not that. But again, school choice supporters will tell you that they are in favor of that.
Ready for me. In reference to the achievement gap, it hasn't been solved for 25 years, correct?
It hasn't been solved for longer than that, I would say.
I bet.
Yeah.
I'm behind, yeah. Do you see any, I guess every state's different, I assume, in trying to solve it?
It is not an easy thing at all, as someone who's written about segregation a great deal. And part of the reason for that is still simply racism. We have an ongoing problem where even a higher achieving school that has the threshold is somewhere around 35%, but above 35% of the students are Black. Even a high achieving school, white parents will avoid that school. Absent court-ordered integration, which was not popular in most places, it's extremely hard to address that issue. What's sort of interesting, in some communities, in urban areas that are deeply segregated, like Detroit is one of the places where I don't write about it, but I edit the reporter's copy. Detroit is not even really possible to desegregate anymore. And you have a lot of charter schools there, huge charter population there. And a lot of the charter schools that are in the suburbs, like the ring right around Detroit, a lot of the kids going to them are actually from Detroit. And so it's not an easy thing to solve. I mean, I think segregation and the achievement gap are not always the same thing, right? Because a lot of Black communities will tell you that they care less about the integration and more about the outcomes. I ran into that in Florida quite a bit, where it was like, yeah, great if you can integrate the schools, but can we just get better schools? And some of the things that may help when you're talking about low-performing segregated schools are giving staff members a lot more money to work there, which is not often popular with teachers' unions for a lot of reasons. But sometimes those jobs have a lot of burnout. So sometimes the money incentive, you might be able to attract experienced teachers because you often don't have experienced teachers in those schools. Extra time in school is often a big thing because you're making up for what someone hasn't gotten in one place or another at home or at school. And so year-round schooling, again, not always popular, but if you can give people extra time. And then enrichment. A lot of public schools that are segregated are horribly under-resourced. And So you don't have music programs, and you've cut art, and the class sizes are too big, and so you're not giving kids what they need as just a whole child education. But all of that costs money. So a lot of it comes down to what are we willing to pay for?
We started education reform in Kentucky in the early 90s, and I see a parallel in the achievement gap in education reform. Kentucky's one of 19 states that was, my last, could have changed a little bit, but to make students take the standardized test, achievement test in English. And I've got 180 kids in my school that don't speak English. Yeah. And I think that would help the achievement gap. There's so many, there were 2 schools in Owensboro, Kentucky in the 90s that Clinton came down to one and Bush came down to another that by all statistics were supposed to be failing, but they were doing gangbusters. And they said one of the things they did was touch, they hugged, you're not supposed to touch. And the other thing was they had a really nice reward store, and it had really nice things if you acted good and did your work. Mm-hmm. And the part that was candy, and food. And the laws say you can't use food to reward a child because it's a basic need. So, you darn if you do and darn if you don't.
Well, you can't use food, but you can use M&Ms. That's what I say with my children.
Okay.
I won't withhold broccoli, but you can have M&Ms if you clean my house.
I guess like I said, I'm still in the schools, and the teachers complain that there's no scaffolding. And I agree with that. I don't see any scaffolding. What else? What about the NEA? Do you see them being, what are they doing to help solve the achievement gap?
Advocating for more funding. It's usually what the teachers' unions are going for. And there is a research base to that, greater funding. Even depending on how you pay, what you're paying for, just greater investment in the school system does tend to have a beneficial effect on outcomes. That's usually their focus.
So when the subtitle on your book is
How the Conservatives Won.
It's called The Death of Public Schools, and then How Conservatives Won the War Over Education in America. So you're talking about if the achievement gap hasn't been solved in 25 years, people are going to try to come up with solutions. Mm-hmm. So, and like you just eloquently and unbelievably described, it was just very impressive. People are trying to come up with ways to end it. So you can blame one party for that, or why is that you say?
Oh, why I say they won?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a few people who really would prefer winning, like the gerund would help. But for me, you could look at this in different ways. But for me, what I came down to, the argument that I arrived at, and I will tell you just for fun, I mentioned the subtitle to my husband one night in the kitchen, and he does not cover education. He's a journalist, but doesn't typically cover education. And he kind of turned and said, have they won? Like, I got a preview of what the reaction might be. And I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. But the reason that I came down on that was when you look at where it started, when Milton Friedman and Virgil Bloom and folks were first making these arguments, and basically everybody attended public school. And the early attempts to create vouchers were so tiny, and there was no real legal precedent for it, very little, to what we have now. And you could, legislation can change and programs can be killed. The first and only school choice program that's been successfully killed has been in Illinois in the last year or so. But for me, it came down to the courts. The victories on the courts, and with the Supreme Court that we have, I don't think those precedents are going away. And those court victories, Republican supporters of choice very smartly, I think, strategized around how to win both at the state and the federal level on the courts. And one of the people who's in the book, who's a Republican lawyer who argued a lot of these cases, told me he thought his opponent probably won more cases, but they won at the Supreme Court. And so that's what said, okay, we can have this. And now every case since then is built on it. And so to me, those court victories are very hard to undo. And so enrollment may fluctuate, funding might change, but the court victories are very hard to undo. And you'll see that with people who oppose school choice programs in states. They're like, it's like a whack-a-mole fight of trying to change these things. But very few people have successfully brought something, like ended a program.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
But I appreciate the questions. I should have brought like a cough drop or something. I forget how much talking kills your throat.
First of all, I'd like to defend the teachers that quit in the middle of the day.
Oh.
I was talking to
Don't
my
worry,
neighbor.
I've always felt bad for them.
My neighbor across the street has a daughter. This is her first year of teaching third grade. And the lady across the hall from her was hit by a pair of scissors by a third grader in the face.
Yeah.
She went to the desk, picked her purse up, and went home. So not all that it's not always that lady's fault.
Oh no, I know. My mom is a retired special ed teacher. I keep touching this and this is making the quality worse. My sister is a current special ed teacher, and she was assaulted by a student a few years ago. And oh, thank you, a mint. You get the free book. And but my sister was assaulted by a student a few years ago, and then God bless her, she volunteered to work with him after school. I was like, the kid beat you up, but it's a very hard job. It's going to make my voice sound terrible, but it's a very hard job.
The money, I'm a retired high school science teacher from Texas.
And now he
And
comes out
every
with it.
time I got a raise, we lost a custodian, or they closed a shop class,
Yeah.
or they fill in the blank. And the last time I got a raise, I wrote before the raise, please don't give me a raise. I don't want to lose another custodian.
Yeah.
I had a custodian at the elevator in tears because she wasn't going to get finished that night and somebody was going to write her up. So the point is, when they throw money at it, they might give the teachers a raise because it makes a newspaper, but the shop class, which the kids go to school for,
Yeah.
they don't go to school I didn't go for history class, right? The parent participation, she was talking about moving to an area to get to a better school. And if you wanted something, in 1980, the best predictor of high school success was how long a person had that phone number. That was before we had cell phones and they moved with you. But the real predictor was how long they'd lived in that house. If you have a neighborhood where people stay and live there, it was the best predictor of high school outcomes. I would say today, high school, when it's open house, if you have every kid with a parent there, you've got a successful school because you can reach a parent. I have taught inner city kids my career, and 2/3 of my parents I can't reach, and 20% of them you can't reach with a search warrant. And those kids, public schools don't get the option to say, Jimmy, you beat the shit out of Scott on the school bus. You can't come back. And other schools can. And that's you need to have that. You said something about Cleveland not pushing, not voting for more money for their schools.
Mm-hmm.
My soapbox is Justin Verlander makes more money every time he throws a ball than a medical researcher does in a whole year. Every time he throws the ball when he's on the mound, he makes that's the reason my generation hadn't cured cancer. That's my soapbox. So Cleveland has a huge room and rental car tax. We went to the Cincinnati Reds, and 88% of that stadium is paid for by taxpayers. My wife might be a Houston Astros fan, but we can't watch the Houston Astros unless we pay for a separate TV channel. The public that paid for that stadium doesn't get to watch them unless you'll buy ESPN Plus or something like that. But
I like the turn we've taken to baseball. I would like to know if anyone's paying attention to the Yankee game by chance. Anyone have a phone with? Just wondering. Yes.
But the money that's going, Cleveland's paying. I paid a 27% tax on my hotel room, and the lady said, A lot of that is going to the new football and baseball stadiums. And Cleveland paying that 88% tax, maybe we could shift some of that money away from Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster's getting 14%, and they have no dog in the hunt. They didn't pay for anybody's salary or the stadium. Maybe if we could shift Ticketmaster out and put that in public schools, we wouldn't have to, the taxpayer wouldn't have to work on it. But the person that got the scissors in the face, I would have left too.
Yeah, that's fairly understandable.
Yankees are up 2-0, and we've got to wrap this up in time for her to sign books. So if we could get our last 2 questions.
I am hoping for a Subway series. I'm just going to put that out there.
My question will be really short. You mentioned earlier about safety and, incidents like kind of what he was saying and other things that are in the news about teachers being harmed or students being more difficult. Is that just appearance, or is there any data to back that up? And kind of might not make a really difference as far as what parents are going to do, but do you think it might?
Well, there has been, with the pandemic, we saw a real increase in behavior issues. I think some of that, I would like to say it's starting to settle down, but that has been an issue with kids coming back to school. And you would think it would settle down in like the first year, everyone would get back, but it really hasn't. There's been a huge issue with behavior in schools. There's also been really a mental health crisis with kids, just very challenging mental health issues, especially with girls since the pandemic. And so I think schools are dealing with a lot of complicated issues. Just getting kids to school to come back on a regular basis. Chronic absenteeism has also been extremely high since the pandemic. And in some places it was fairly high to begin with, but it's gotten worse. And so I think that's been a real issue. And now I'm forgetting the second part of the question. You can shout. Well, private schools in particular have more ability to select students. So some of the kids, when they get bounced, out of school situations, a private school is not necessarily a place for them, right? And with charter schools, the data depends a little bit on where you are, but let's say Los Angeles, for instance, has a fairly robust charter sector, and we've seen an increase in students with disabilities in the traditional public schools versus the charters. Because in some cases, the private schools and the charter schools can't serve them. And so parents are they have choices, but they don't necessarily always have good choices. And so I don't know how that might affect parents' selection of schools, but safety is a really huge concern for a lot of parents. And when there has been polling of parents, that's often one of their top concerns.
You may have heard that for those of us who are strongly in support of public education locally, Jefferson County, we've just our director of education has just resigned, Marty Polio, and
I did not hear that. You didn't mention this back there. I see.
And we are reeling in Jefferson County about things that are going on, and there's also an effort that to split the Jefferson County district, denied by everyone who's involved with it that it's a racist move. It's clearly a racist move, East End and West End, black and white, and it's really very disturbing and worrisome.
I had not heard that about the superintendent. When was that announced? Someone shouted out to me. Oh, okay. I can be forgiven for maybe not knowing then through the end of the year.
He's giving notice.
Is he retiring? He doesn't. I'm just going to say, maybe I shouldn't say, he does not look old enough to retire. Okay. All right. I don't want to comment on someone's appearance, but I met him and I don't recall thinking retirement was approaching. So that's interesting.
Thank you all for coming tonight. That was fantastic. Let's do it one more time.